Hello and welcome to the first installment of the Health Storytelling Author Q&A series for the spring semester of this academic year. I'm Maryn McKenna. I'm a journalist and author and senior fellow in the Center for the Study of Human Health at Emory University, which makes me the curator of this series and your host as we undertake our latest set of author conversations. In a moment, I'll introduce you to my guest, Mallary Tenore Tarpley, and her amazing new book from Simon & Schuster, Slip: Life in the Middle of Eating Disorder Recovery. It's a powerful work of memoir and reporting that uses her own experience with an eating disorder to explore the scientific and social challenges of treating this complex problem and restoring to health those who experience it. First, though, I'm going to tell you about this series, and I have a note for those of you who've been watching us for a while. You'll notice that everything about my side has changed. The old set for this series was my actual office, but I've moved, and I'm still setting up what my new office and live stream space will look like. So for now, you just get my face and the wall behind me. Come back next month and in April, and you'll get to see how things might be evolving. Now, let me tell you about this semester's series. At least once per month during the academic year, we invite writers whose journalistic or academic books examine health, the science and history of health, and health's intersection with society. This series of conversations is sponsored by the Emory Center for the Study of Human Health, along with an array of fantastic co-sponsors. This spring, those are the Georgia Center for the Book, which is a local affiliate of the Library of Congress that stages very frequent public conversations with authors, illustrators, poets, and others to bring the news of new books to the public. And Emory's Center for Public Scholarship and Engagement. They create opportunities for faculty and staff and students to share ideas with local and global audiences. And in addition, we're also sponsored by the center's new Ideas Festival, Emory, which has now produced 2 annual celebrations of thought-provoking authors, scholars, and performers on Emory's Oxford campus. And in addition, the middle appearance in this spring series will be a special issue sponsored and co-produced by the Atlanta Science Festival. I'm thrilled to have us back with them again. So let me tell you who's appearing in this series this semester. A reminder, we're live streamed on YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram, and archived on YouTube. The authors appearing this semester are, tonight, Mallary Tenore Tarpley of the University of Texas with Slip, which was published by the Simon Element imprint of Simon & Schuster in August 2025. On Thursday, the 19th of March, Dr. Tom Frieden, the former director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and CEO of the nonprofit Resolve to Save Lives. His new book is The Formula for Better Health: How to Save Millions of Lives, Including Your Own, which was published by the MIT Press in September. Dr. Frieden's appearance is a co-production with the Atlanta Science Festival. And finally, on Wednesday, April 22nd, Jason Gale, who's a powerhouse science editor with Bloomberg News, will speak to us about his book, After COVID: The Health Impacts That Will Last Generations, which isn't out yet. It will be published by Johns Hopkins University Press in March, and Jason will talk to us about it just 1 month later. So one final note, this is a live event. You can interact with us, and we encourage you to do that. If you want to ask a question, please comment or reply on any of the platforms where you're watching us, and our producer, who is Stephen Kaplan of Spin It Social, will make sure we see what you said. Do note, I'll turn to your questions in the second half of this 60-minute live stream, but you can put your questions in at any time. I want to note as we begin that we are going to be discussing eating disorders. If you're struggling or know of someone who is, please visit the National Alliance for Eating Disorders website for a free helpline and related resources. Their link is allianceforeatingdisorders.com. Now, let's turn to our book and guest. Mallary Tenore Tarpley is an assistant professor of practice at the University of Texas at Austin, and formerly the associate director of UT Austin's Knight Center for Journalism in the Americas, as well as formerly managing editor at the journalism nonprofit, the Poynter Institute. Her journalism has appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and Time Magazine. Mallary, welcome to this series.
For having me, Maryn. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I always ask people to start with this question. Tell our audience who you are and how you came to write this book.
Sure. So I'm a journalist by trade, and I have always wanted to write a book. I've identified as a writer for most of my life, and from the age of 17, I began working on different iterations of this book slip. Every few years, I would write a different iteration of the book and really wanted it to see the light of day. But I always thought that I needed to be fully recovered from my eating disorder before the story would be worthy of publication. And so I kept writing it, hoping that the day would arrive that I would be fully recovered, but recognizing that that was not my reality. And so it wasn't until I wrote a piece for the New York Times in 2021 where I began to be more honest and open about my ongoing recovery, that I then began to realize that there was an audience and a need for a book like mine that explored what it was like to be in the middle of recovery. The reader responses to that article were just so significant that I realized that there was a narrative to be told. And so I ended up really working on the book in earnest over a 5-year period from about 2021 to 2025. And started to really do a lot of reporting for the book, recognizing that I didn't want this to be my story alone. So was able to bring together both my experience as a writer, but also my experiences as a journalist to do a lot of reporting to both broaden my own scope of understanding around eating disorders, but also to open up more points of relatability for readers.
I think one of the things that's so powerful about the book is not just your story, but the way in which you weave the science of eating disorders, which it seems to me has changed over the time of the book's narrative, let's say, from when you first from when the disorder exhibited itself in you to now, and we'll get to that. But I want to start, for my own benefit and also for the benefit of folks watching us, with how we should talk about this book and about you. Because obviously you tell the story of your developing an eating disorder, first as a preteen, and then your periods of recovery. But when you and I were chatting in the run-up to this event, you mentioned to me that you don't like to use words like victim or survivor to describe yourself. So what language do you think is appropriate for you and for others who've had this experience?
So I always say that it's really important to identify the language that resonates most with you. And I believe that there is a wide array of language and words that we can use to describe where we're at in recovery. And part of what I do is I talk about how I am in what I call the middle place of recovery. So I am a woman who is in this middle place, which is this name I've given to this liminal space between acute sickness and full recovery. Because for many years, I tried to use the language of full recovery. And I would say that I was a woman who was fully recovered from anorexia. But I found that that language ultimately failed me because I wasn't finding myself in this place of full recovery. And yet I didn't have the words to to describe where I actually was. And so very often in the world of eating disorders, we do tend to use more black and white language like victim and survivor, or acute sickness and full recovery, or terminal versus curable. And for me, I often think as a writer about how there is this vast semantic expanse in between those extremes. And I'm a big believer in finding the language within that expanse to really articulate our experiences. And I think that the more we can expand our vocabulary for talking about recovery, the more inclusive we can be when we share narratives about what recovery actually looks like and how it plays out.
Those are such important points. Thank you for articulating that. I think we should probably start where the book starts, with where your first experience of disordered eating came from. Tell us that story.
Yeah, so my mother was sick with metastatic breast cancer for 3 years. She was diagnosed when I was 8 years old and then died from the disease when I was 11. And her death came as a complete shock, even though the cancer had spread to her bone marrow, her liver, her brain. My family and I really held on to this narrative that my mother was a warrior and that she was going to survive. And so we did use a lot of this battle-like language to describe her condition. And as a young child, I really believed she was going to be okay. And so when she died, it felt like my whole world had fallen apart. But I did what I knew how to do best, which was to pretend that I was okay. And so I put on a happy face. I went to school 14 hours after my mother had died. She died on a Sunday night. I walked to school alone on Monday morning. I read the eulogy at her funeral without crying. And people praised me for being strong and resilient. But I found that the more that time passed, the farther away I felt from my mother. And as a 12-year-old, I conjured up this idea that maybe if I stayed the same size I was when my mom was alive, I could somehow be closer to her. And that's a very complicated thought for a 12-year-old to have, but I have journal entries from that time that really expressed the sentiment. And so for me, the eating disorder did not start off as a way to get skinny. It really started off as a way for me to remain close to my mother and to feel smaller and safer. And so food restriction was almost this warped form of time travel. And I restricted my food intake and did not have the words to describe what it was I was struggling with. I didn't know I had anorexia, because I thought people with anorexia didn't eat anything at all. And I didn't think that my body fit what a person with anorexia looked like. And so it took a fair amount of time for my father to actually get the proper care and treatment for me, largely because I was trying to hide my behaviors, but also because the medical establishment and the doctors we were seeing just did not know how to properly diagnose me.
So you make the point late in the book, reflecting back on your experience, that to say my mother died and I developed anorexia as a result is simplistic, that there are many other influences that contributed, both in your own personal psychology, but also in society and in the timing, as you just referenced, the things that were going on in school, including other like scientific things that we now know about, but that science may not have known about then. I'm jumping ahead a bit. I promise I'll come back to the narrative, but how did you come to terms with the way that all of these influences may have contributed to your developing this disordered eating?
I'm so glad you mentioned that, because I think over time we do tend to simplify narratives, and sometimes we pinpoint one thing that we think is the root cause of an illness or an ailment. And when I was working on the book, I really wanted to peel back the layers of how and why I developed an eating disorder. And I remember I was getting my master's in fine arts and creative nonfiction, and that was really when I began to work on the manuscript and the latest iteration of it. And I had a professor who read a line in which I had said that my mother's death caused my eating disorder. And she said, "Was that the sole cause?" And it was the first time that anyone had ever challenged that narrative. And so it got me thinking about all the other influences that were at play at the time. And I remember distinctly after hearing that question that I used to read 17 magazine, which was a popular teen magazine back in the 90s and earlier. And so I out of curiosity, just Googled the first issue that I ever got, because I remember my dad bought me a subscription the month after my mother died because he thought the magazine might help answer womanly questions that he couldn't answer.
Oof.
And so I went back and looked at the archives and very distinctly recognized the cover when I saw it. And I looked at one of the cover story titles, and it was titled "Girls Who Exercise Themselves to Death." And so I very promptly ordered the issue on eBay and then accessed the digital version through my university's library, and realized that that story was about girls struggling with anorexia. And it occurred to me that that was likely my first exposure to what anorexia actually was. Around the same time, I was also enrolled in a 7th grade health class where we were learning about quote unquote good foods and bad foods, and we were being told what we should and shouldn't eat. And we were even weighed in front of classmates. And that was really challenging for me, even as a child in a smaller body, because I even then had the impression that the smaller the number was on the scale, the better. And so in hearing the teacher talk about food in good and bad ways, I began to ascribe moral values to food and began to think that I was good if I was eating good foods and I was bad if I was eating bad food, so to speak. And as a perfectionistic people pleaser, I wanted to do well in the eyes of my teacher. And so I began to monitor what my father ate and then quickly realized that that was not working. And so then internalized that and started to restrict my own food intake. But there really was this confluence of factors at play. And I realized too later on that when you do restrict your food intake, it does lead to neurobiological changes that can really keep people stuck in eating disorder behaviors. So there was so much that I learned as I really unpacked the origin story. And I think that for many of us struggling with eating disorders, it's often the result of many different things. Sometimes that's not always the case. I interviewed some individuals whose disorder started after they had choking incidents, where that triggered them to stop eating. And then the food restriction sort of triggered these other bodily responses that kept them rooted in restriction. So everyone's narrative is different, but for me, really looking at the complexities of the origin story helped me to better understand how I ended up with such a serious eating disorder.
Looking back, are you surprised that this happened to you?
So that's a great question that no one has asked me. And I mean, thinking about my own temperament traits, it's not entirely surprising. I do often wonder if my mother were still alive today, if I would have developed an eating disorder, because it does seem as though the trauma and the suppressed grief is largely what led to the disorder. But I do have many of the temperament traits that can predispose one to developing an eating disorder. So I am risk averse, I am perfectionistic, I am rigid, and I recognize these traits, and I've always had them, right? They are part of who I am. And so it in some ways is not surprising, but I always wonder, what if, right? What if my mother hadn't died? What if I had been encouraged to cry and grieve? Would I then have developed the eating disorder? And those are questions that I will never have the answer to, but it's hard not to wonder. And I even address those questions in the book and write them out, because as a writer and journalist who wants to seek clarity and find answers, it's hard wrestling with questions that are really ultimately unanswerable.
The first phase of your illness, the acute phase, this was a long journey. You actually do the math later in the book. You were acutely ill, so hospitalized or in long-term residential treatment for 89 weeks. The math is 134 total days in medical and psych units and 489 days at the residential treatment unit. That's a lot. At a point where you're just emerging into adolescence or delaying adolescence. Just reflect for us for a minute on sort of how you got through this extended period.
Yes, it was a lot of treatment. And I want to acknowledge that I was very lucky that I got treatment. There are many individuals who struggle with eating disorders and really encounter a lot of barriers to care and don't ever get treatment. And so I was lucky in that my father was able to recognize I needed it. And financially, we were able to make it work because the Department of Mental Health in Massachusetts, where I lived, as well as my public school system, actually paid for my treatment. That's almost unheard of these days, but I unpack that in the book. But without that support, there's no way my father would have been able to afford such care. But yes, I was hospitalized at Boston Children's Hospital on 5 separate occasions. So that was from October of 1998 to March of 1999, and was on the medical unit twice and then the psychiatric ward for 3 times. And usually the psych ward stays were anywhere from 6 to 8 weeks. And the reason that I was there on the ward was because of the eating disorder, but also because I was struggling with a lot of common comorbidities like obsessive compulsive disorder and anxiety and depression. And I was very much caught in this revolving door of treatment where I would begin to scratch the surface of why I had developed an eating disorder when I was hospitalized, but it always felt like there was never enough time. My weight would get restored and my physical symptoms would improve when I was in the hospital, but it was hard to really begin to grieve and to work on the psychological underpinnings. And so my treatment team recommended a higher level of care. And so I was sent to residential treatment for 17 months, which is an almost unheard of amount of stay these days. Typically nowadays, the average residential stay is more like 30 days, give or take. And so it really was in residential treatment that I was able to really make meaningful progress forward. I often say Boston Children's Hospital saved my life, and I don't think that that's an exaggeration. I got a lot of amazing care there, and they recognized how to treat me. But I really needed the time in residential to begin to grieve, to begin to figure out how I could remain close to my mother apart from anorexia, to begin to eat different foods and recognize that the eating disorder was not the solution to my problems, but actually the problem itself. But it was very challenging being away from home for that long, being out of school. I was taking classes, so I was getting school credit, but the classes were quite rudimentary. But it was challenging too, in the sense that I really began to identify as an eating disorder patient. I was in this mindset of being institutionalized. I thought, well, I am sick enough to be hospitalized. I am anorexic. And I remember distinctly shifting from saying I have anorexia to I am anorexic. And that very much began to take shape the more I was hospitalized and the longer I was institutionalized. So there were definitely a lot of drawbacks to being in treatment for so long, even though it ultimately did help me.
I actually gasped out loud at that point in the book where you do the math, and I realized how long you were in institutions and how long you were away from what we would think of as normal life. But and of course, I even though you were describing it at the moment at which you do that math, it's still struck me that the length of your treatment suggests very beautifully the paradoxical way in which you developed a kind of loyalty to your illness, that you were sort of you elucidate that you were choosing its messages, anorexia's messages to you, over the treatment's prompts to you to get better. And you quote one of your journals from the time of wanting to be a perfect anorexic, and that just broke my heart.
Yes. Yeah. It broke my heart too as I was going through all of my old journal entries. I had about 30 plus journals that I kept from the time I was a child all throughout my early 20s. And the ones from my days in treatment were the hardest to go through. It felt like I was climbing this emotional Mount Everest at times. And yes, I had this line in the journal where I talked about wanting to be the sickest and most perfect anorexic in the entire world. And it breaks my heart now hearing that and thinking that that was my mindset. But what's interesting is that when I was doing research for the book, there was a lot of research I came across that really helped me to empathize with my younger self and get a better understanding of why I was so invested in wanting to have the identity of someone with anorexia. And it turns out that adolescents' development of self and identity is very closely linked to brain development. And so when adolescents begin to establish their adult identity, these connections are formed in the brain. And to make these connections, the brain relies on white matter, which is made up of myelin, which is just this insulating layer that surrounds the nerve cells. But the production of myelin partly relies on a person's dietary fat consumption. So starvation then really significantly alters the brain's white matter. And so for teenagers like me struggling with anorexia, these white matter alterations can result in this distorted sense of self and altered neurodevelopment. And so these sort of underlying neurobiological factors, which scientists are really just beginning to understand, can help explain why people with anorexia, and particularly adolescents, can get very fixated on wanting the title of being anorexic. As distorted as it seems, there are actually sort of these neurobiological changes at play that help us to make sense of why this is happening.
So just what you just said is a perfect encapsulation of the way in which this book moves between your personal story, the larger science of eating disorder, and also, which I want to talk about in a minute, the research that you yourself did, the essentially ethnographic research among other people who have experienced eating disorders in the past. That point that your brain chemistry might have been changed, and therefore your psychology would have been changed as a result of what you were eating and not eating, gives so much resonance to your story beyond your own personal compelling narrative. So as a science writer myself, it was extremely exciting to see that. So thank you for doing that.
Yes, of course.
So, but you know, in your story, you do eventually reach a place that feels like you're getting better, even though there were these moments when you kind of didn't want to get better. And you return home to your father and to the person who was at that time his fiance, and you go back to high school, and then you go on to college, and outwardly you're normal. You're even excelling. You are being so good at being that perfectionist person whom you described. But behind the scenes, you were struggling, developing restrictive behaviors again. So how did that happen?
Yes. So thank you so much too for the close read of the book. It's always wonderful talking with folks who have clearly read it and remembered parts. And so, yes, when I left treatment, I was really intent on achieving the gold standard of full recovery. And yet I didn't really know what that meant. And even still today, as I learned through reporting the book, there's still not a consensus definition of what full recovery actually
Which is
means.
just shocking to me, I have to say.
Yes, I think that we can all define recovery on our own terms, but when it comes to research, it makes it really hard to compare data across studies because there is no lack of there is a sort of no actual definition. And so to expect people to achieve full recovery and yet to not actually define what it means can really lead to a lot of confusion on patients' part. And for me, it was very confusing. I, in the absence of a definition, really equated it with perfectionism. And I thought, okay, I need to be perfect at my recovery. So I went back to high school my junior year and ended up getting all A's and joining all the extracurriculars I could. I stopped going to therapy and I got off of the medications I had been on because I thought I didn't need them anymore. And I tried to eat just the right amount, whatever that means. I tried to exercise just the right amount. And I thought, well, if this is what full recovery looks like, then I must be getting an A+. But I, underneath the surface, was beginning to hear anorexia knocking at the door, so to speak. There were some familial changes that I was experiencing where my father was getting remarried, and There were the pressures of going to college and wanting to succeed and excel academically. When I went to college, I was on my own, and I began to just experience a lot of disordered thoughts, very similar to the ones that I had experienced when I was acutely sick. And it felt like I could hear anorexia knocking at the door, and I was trying to tune out the knocking and trying to keep the door shut. But anorexia really just barged in like an uninvited house guest, and just took over my mind and my body again. And so my freshman year of college, I fell into this very vicious cycle of binge eating and restricting. So I would oscillate between those two behaviors. And I had never experienced binge eating before. And it wasn't until I started researching the book that I learned that people who have anorexia will very often go on to develop binge eating behaviors, often when they are working toward recovery. In fact, 50% of people with anorexia will develop these behaviors, and the field refers to it as diagnostic crossover. And so I did not know this at the time, and I felt like I was failing at full recovery and failing at anorexia. So I stayed silent about it. And because I was not merely restricting, I was binge eating and restricting, my weight didn't really change. And so I didn't look sick. There were no physical indications that I was struggling. And so family members and friends thought that I was fine. And yet beneath the surface, I was struggling with something that I didn't quite know how to name. It didn't feel like anorexia, but it felt like this new iteration of my disorder. So there was this great misalignment between the narrative that I was sharing with the world, which was that I was fully recovered, and the one that I was living out behind closed doors. And I didn't know how to reconcile that.
It's really striking to me, and you make this point not only in the context of your own story, but also in the context of the stories of other people whom you interviewed, that medicine thought you were recovered because you'd started to eat again and you gained weight. And the delta between what they think of or thought of at the time as you're being recovered because of those outward signs and what you experienced in the psychological help you still needed, not only was, to me, is really dismaying, but clearly set you up for a lapse or a relapse, because the things that were behind the restricted eating had never been fully addressed.
Yes, that's very true. And I will say that I was petrified of gaining weight and of eating when I got to residential treatment, because when I had been hospitalized, it seemed that whenever my weight got back up to a certain number, then soon after I would be discharged. And that's very often what happens. Even today, insurance companies will sometimes cut off care once someone reaches a particular body mass index. And so there's a lot of systemic issues at play there. But when I got to residential treatment, for the first couple of months, I was really just drinking the Ensure supplements. We could either eat our meal or drink the caloric equivalent in Ensure. And the reason I was doing that was because I was so afraid that if my treatment team saw that I was eating, then they would think that I was okay and they would send me home before I was ready. And so although I was able to be in residential for far longer than most people are today, it was still really difficult to not get over this idea of thinking that my recovery was simply tied to my weight. I knew that recovery was going to be far more complicated than just gaining weight and eating food. And so many of the people I interviewed for the book said that even once they had ceased their eating disorder behaviors, whether they were struggling with binge eating disorder or bulimia or anorexia, they still had these cognitive distortions and these ruminations. And oftentimes the cognitive aspects of eating disorders are not accounted for in definitions of full recovery. And so that really complicates issues, because is one fully recovered if they're still having these cognitive distortions? That's a question I think we really need to unpack more as we think about what it actually means to fully recover. Because we know that if one continues to have these disordered thoughts, they very often can lead to disordered behaviors. And so particularly once someone leaves treatment, that's often just the beginning of the recovery process. And so it's really then that people need continued support. And I think there's greater awareness of that now. But when I was in treatment in the late 90s, early 2000s, there was less awareness of that. And so it was not uncommon for someone like me to go from a year and a half in residential treatment to going home, right? I just sort of made that very jarring transition, and suddenly felt like I'd lost a lot of support at a time when I probably needed it the most.
So one of the folks watching has asked about whether there has been a change in this. We'll put her comment back up. Has there been improvement in addressing the possibility or the likelihood of these sort of cognitive distortions and setbacks? What do you think?
I do think that there has been a change in terms of how we look at treatment. I was really keen on looking at the evolution of care because I wanted to see how care has changed since when I was in treatment. And one of the big changes is that we now have something called stepped care, meaning that people can step up or down the level of care depending on their needs. And so rather than having a patient be in residential treatment and then go home immediately, there are these in-between steps where they could go to a partial hospitalization program or an outpatient program. And I think that this stepped care model does recognize that there is this in-between space between when someone leaves treatment and then once they're better enough to not necessarily need that level of treatment or care anymore. So that is certainly an improvement. And I think it's sometimes in these in-between steps where we can do a better job of addressing some of the lingering cognitive distortions. There also is now what's known as family-based treatment, which began to emerge in 2001, which is the year that I left residential treatment. And it took a little while for it to gain traction, but it really is the gold standard now in treating adolescents with eating disorders. And essentially the idea is that parents are empowered or caregivers are empowered to try to treat the child at home so that the child doesn't end up having to live an institutionalized life like the one that I did. And so because eating disorders can be so enigmatic, it can be really challenging for caregivers to know how to best treat their children. And so this treatment is really aimed at helping parents to be part of the solution, as opposed to years ago when parents were often blamed for causing their child's eating disorder.
So I want to say thank you to the folks who have commented thus far and remind everybody else who's watching us, we see you, thank you, that we welcome your comments and questions. Please put them anywhere where you are watching us, whether it's comments or replies, and as you can see, we will see them. And I will try to post them to Mallary. Mallary, because you were just speaking about how the science has changed, and which implies sort of points to all the work that you did to speak to scientists and researchers about eating disorder treatment and recovery now, I really would like to hear you talk a bit about the reporting you did among other people who've experienced eating disorders, because you talked to a lot of people.
Yes, that was really important to me. And initially, just out of transparency, I tried to write this initially as a literary memoir. That's how I conceived of it, where I thought, well, this will be largely a story about my own experiences, and I will do reporting on my own life. And I tried to get a book deal with a literary memoir, but ultimately didn't get the book deal for that. And so around this time, this new genre was emerging called Memoir Plus. This idea that it's really hard to get a book deal for a memoir with a commercial publisher if you're not famous and if you don't have a huge platform. I am not famous. I don't have a huge platform. And so I thought, well, maybe I can lean into this Memoir Plus genre more. And so the idea is that you write a memoir plus something else. And that plus could be social commentary. It could be investigation. It could be reportage. And I thought, well, I'm a journalist. Why don't I try to do more reporting? And so I spent a year doing a lot of reporting and then reworked my book proposal and ended up selling it to the Simon & Schuster imprint based on the idea that it would not just be a memoir about my own story, but really it would be a narrative nonfiction book that blended personal narrative with research and reporting. And so while I didn't initially conceive of it that way, I'm so glad that I ultimately ended up going down that path, because I think the book is so much richer because it has all of this research and because it has all of these narratives of other people with lived experience. And the more I thought about it, the more it made sense to me too, just in terms of my own values and beliefs, because I very much fit the stereotypical mold of someone with an eating disorder, and that I am a female, I am white, I live in a smaller body, I'm middle to upper class. And I didn't want this to just be another book written by someone who fits that stereotypical mold. And so for me, it was really important to include a diversity of voices from people struggling with all different types of eating disorders, not just anorexia, and from people of all different genders and ages and races and body types and sizes. And so I ended up surveying over 700 people with lived experience with an eating disorder from 44 states and 37 countries. And I surveyed all of them and really used the survey results as a way to identify individuals who I wanted to interview. And looking at all of the responses really widened my scope of understanding around how eating disorders play out differently depending on population and demographics. And as part of my reporting, I also did about 175 interviews with survey respondents and with clinicians and researchers, because I wanted to talk with clinicians about different developments in eating disorder treatment. I wanted to talk with them about this concept of the middle place and hear their thoughts. And I wanted to include research to show really how far we've come in terms of understanding eating disorders, and also how far we still have to go. And so while I was working on the book, I was lucky enough to get a grant from the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation to really do a lot more science reporting. And so with that grant, I was able to take a lot of reporting trips and go to different conferences where I could interview researchers who were studying the genetics of eating disorders and also the neurobiology of them.
So I want to talk now about this question of this concept of the middle place. And this is a good time to show another comment from someone who's watching, which asks about the title of the book, this idea that you can slip back and forth in and out of the disorder, in and out of recovery. It's a really provocative idea, because it immediately, this concept of the middle place, because it immediately shows that there's not a binary to recovery, that you are recovered or you are ill. So how did you develop that? And did you come up with the concept first and then realized it described you, or were you looking for something to describe your situation?
Yes. Well, thank you so much for that question. And I really started to come up with this idea of the middle place when I was in my late 20s. And so by that time, I had been struggling with binge eating and restricting for about 10 years. And so at the time, I was running a small nonprofit, and I was tasked with helping to develop a new genre that we called restorative narrative. And so I was training journalists on how to tell these stories, and I was really encouraging them to tell these restorative narratives, which essentially are narratives that show how people in communities are making meaningful progress forward in the aftermath of trauma or tragedy or illness. And they reveal a fuller narrative arc from heartbreak to hope, from sickness to wellness. And so as I was working with journalists and helping them to tell these types of stories, it occurred to me that this could actually be a really helpful framework for thinking about my own story in recovery. And so I began to consider the possibility that maybe I was in this messy middle with my recovery. And I started to refer to it as the middle place.
Hmm.
And for many years, I gave thought to the middle place. I would journal about it, but I wasn't quite ready to speak truth to it publicly. It wasn't until I wrote that piece for the New York Times that I actually really put a name to it in a public way and started to talk more about it. But I think for me, what's been so revelatory about naming this place is that it really helps me to just see my recovery as imperfect and ongoing. And that in many ways is refreshing, because for so long I tried to reach full recovery and was so frustrated that I couldn't seem to reach it. And now I think about how recovery can be this middle place where slips happen and progress is always possible. Years ago, when I was binge eating and restricting, it felt like anytime I slipped, I would just let it turn into an uncontrollable slide, largely because I was too afraid to admit that I had slipped. I was really ashamed of that. And so I was silent about every slip. And living in the middle place is about speaking truth to these slips and recognizing that they can happen many years into recovery. I'm 25 years into my recovery and I still sometimes slip. But I remember when I was interviewing an eating disorder dietitian about the book, I told her that I planned to title it Slip. And she said, well, I wouldn't title it that because that word has a very negative connotation in our field. And I said, well, that's precisely the point. I said, we need to recognize that slips are so common in eating disorder recovery, particularly in our society, which is very much steeped in fat phobia and diet culture. And we need to encourage people to talk about slips and normalize them rather than stigmatizing them. And so I felt like it was in some ways very bold to title the book Slip, particularly within the context of eating disorders. And I've had to tell people why it's important to talk about slips, just as I've had to also explain that the middle place is not about giving up on recovery. It's not about settling for stagnancy, and nor is it quasi or pseudo recovery. Those are two terms that are very often used in the eating disorder field. And I remember people would use them to describe this middle place in some ways. They're usually used to describe people who are better than they once were, but not all better. But I think they can actually be quite pernicious because they can make people feel like they are faking at their recovery or that it's somehow not real. And so the middle place is rooted in this idea that recovery is real, recovery is possible, but it is very much filled with slippage, right? And so I think that it's just also a place that is marked not by guilt, but by growth and the idea that growth can be ongoing. So I also like to say too that living in the middle place doesn't preclude the possibility of full recovery. I did interview some individuals who identify with the term full recovery and consider themselves to be fully recovered. And so I think that it's important to recognize that almost all of us cross through this middle place at some point. And the question is whether or not we actually arrive at full recovery. And I like to say too that it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to arrive there, right? I think you can live a really full life from within the middle place. And that's something that I'm really trying to talk a lot about. I will just say lastly that of the 700 plus people I surveyed for the book, 85% said that they could identify with the middle place, and yet you're not talking about it enough. And I think that that's just a really important point to acknowledge.
So there's something that I think we really should talk about, and we haven't really raised it yet. And that is that we have been talking about your story and the stories of the people whom you interviewed as though they all occur in a vacuum. And yet we know, particularly as women, that we live in a society that insists upon and privileges thinness in women and places enormous pressure on thinness and appearance. I love that you reference the 90s concept of heroin chic among supermodels, how important it was for them to be painfully thin at the time. And of course, now we live in a society that's being wholesale affected by the advent of GLP-1 drugs. So I wonder if you could talk for a minute about the challenge of maintaining or getting in distance of recovery with all those social pressures impinging on you.
Yes, that's such an important question. And it reminds me of an interview that I had with my former medical doctor from Boston Children's Hospital. And I remember interviewing her for the first time when I was working on the book. And I thought that she might be disappointed by the fact that I wasn't fully recovered.
Mm.
And when I talked with her about this concept of the middle place, she said, I think that's a really great name for it. And she said, also, it just helps you to give more grace to yourself. And she said, this is a really hard society to recover into. And
Mhm.
she introduced me to this research term known as normative discontent. This is a term that emerged in 1984. And it essentially is a term to describe the fact that research shows that the vast majority of both men and women in our society have some level of discontent with their body. And so to think that we're going to recover from an eating disorder and never have a bad body image day or never have a fraught relationship with food is almost unrealistic when you consider the society we live in. And at various points throughout history, the pendulum has swung, whereas a few years back, there was more sort of emphasis on this idea of body diversity and body acceptance and body respect. And now the pendulum has really swung back to the thin ideal, which has never really gone away, but we are hearing so much more messaging around thin bodies and this idea that our worth is tied to our weight. And so I find that that is very difficult because constantly I'm bombarded with messages about GLP-1s, and my kids are as well. And I actually wrote an essay about this for USA Today a few months ago, in which I talked about how I was watching Home Alone with my children on Disney Plus, and all of a sudden, all of these GLP-1 ads started popping up
Mm.
on the screen. And I
Mm.
thought, one, why do these need to be shown during a kids movie? And two, how do I talk to my kids about these? And I used to turn down the volume really quickly whenever I would hear these ads on the radio when I was with my kids. But when we were watching this movie, I just let the volume be. And then I used it as an opportunity to talk with my kids about the fact that there are some people who use these drugs and they can be beneficial. And also, they are going to be exposed to messages all their lives that will tell them that they need to exist in a smaller body or that their worth is going to be dependent upon the number on the scale. And I'm having more and more conversations with my kids about this so that they can understand what the thin ideal is and the fact that it is unfortunately a reality in our society, but also so that they can begin to recognize what diet culture is. I think all
Mhm.
too often we don't learn about diet culture. We learn about what we're supposed to eat and not eat in health classes, but we're not taught to identify and call out diet culture. And so I'm really trying to teach my own children that, both as a protective mechanism, because I don't ever want them to develop an eating disorder, but also because I think it empowers them to recognize that even when they hear these messages, they don't have to internalize them. And my kids are 8 and 10. So I know that their exposure to this messaging is only going to increase as they get on social media. But I'm trying to do what I can now as a woman in recovery to tune out these messages as best as I can, but also use them as learning tools for my kids.
One of the parts of the book that I find so lovely is the last couple of chapters where you talk about getting far enough in recovery to feeling that you could have a relationship, to meeting your husband, who sounds like a completely fantastic man. You're very fortunate. And also to thinking about what it is to be vulnerable to restrictive eating, to an eating disorder, and choose to become pregnant and then breastfeed and then start raising children and trying to figure out what the right messaging is for them. The way that you walk the audience through all the decisions you've had to make and all the ways in which you've questioned your decision making, it's really very moving.
Thank you so much. I really wanted to address love and sex and relationships and motherhood in the book because I don't think we hear enough about those topics in eating
Mhm.
disorder literature, and wanted to really talk about what pregnancy was like. It was actually quite a beautiful time for me in terms of my relationship with my body. But I write in the book about how postpartum I ended up experiencing some unexpected challenges where I fell into really obsessive behaviors around breastfeeding and pumping breast milk. And I did did not anticipate that this would be a challenge. And I was very ashamed by it. I was breastfeeding as a means of trying to burn calories and lose the baby weight, so to speak. But it became quite obsessive. And so I was reminded of the times when I was acutely sick as a teenager, and I had lots of obsessive behaviors around exercise. And so it was a really challenging time. I ended up writing an essay for the Dallas Morning News about how I had donated 10 gallons of breast milk to the local milk bank here in Austin, Texas, and was lauded for that. But if you had looked in the white space of that essay and underneath the words, you would have seen a different narrative of a new mother who was very much struggling with these eating disorder-like behaviors. And fortunately, once I stopped breastfeeding, I got out of those behaviors and was able to get back up and move forward in my recovery. But I write about that in the book because there's so little research around that. And so many readers have reached out to say, oh, I thought I was the only one who struggled with that behavior. And I really appreciate you writing about it. So I write about that. I write about motherhood and the fact that sometimes it can feel like I'm mothering with a mix of hope and hypocrisy, in the sense that I talk with my kids about really respecting their body and appreciating their body and thinking of their body not as an ornament, but an instrument. And yet I recognize that it's still hard for me to look at my body in that way. But I really try to exhibit good behaviors with hopes that in cultivating a healthy environment at home, I can mitigate any other risks that they may experience, be it genetic risks that may be at play or just environmental risks outside of the home.
So we're coming up on the top of our hour. So what I usually do at this point is I ask people for any final thoughts. And at the end of the book, you have a last paragraph that is such a perfect distillation of your entire journey. I don't know whether to ask you to read it. It's the paragraph that begins, "I am not a soldier," or if you just like to talk it out to us. But I found that so resonant that I would love for the audience to hear all the different ways in which you're thinking about your identity as a woman, as a patient, as someone in recovery at this moment.
Sure. Well, I would love to read that paragraph. I happen to have it right here in front of me. So it reads, "I am not a soldier fighting a losing battle, nor am I a survivor who defeated a disorder. And I am no longer a girl who believes she needs to be sick to be special. I am a woman who works hard to keep moving forward in the middle place. I sometimes look back at the long distance I've traveled and wonder how it's possible I still have so far to go. On days like this, I remind myself that even though I haven't reached full recovery, I am in full progress. And for me, for many of us, that's a good place to be." And I really wanted to end the book with that because I wanted to just draw some parallels between the young Mallary, who thought that she did need to be a strong warrior, and the one today who recognizes that I'm no less brave or strong just because I haven't reached full recovery. And I want to be able to share that message with others as well, and to recognize that sometimes just having a sense of peace and progress is enough, right? Even if you still contend with the disorder. And so I very much kind of explore these questions of what does it mean to be better, but not all better? And what does it mean to live with the imprints of your disorder, knowing it remains a vulnerability? And those were driving questions that I explored in the book. And they continue to be questions that drive me forward in my recovery as I continue to explore this middle place and move forward in it.
Thank you so much for reading that. And thank you for talking to us. What a fantastic book. What an amazing journey. And I am so glad that you were available to do this. So thanks for coming on.
Yes, thank you so much for having me and for all the great questions. I appreciate it.
And that's it for this episode in the Health Storytelling Author Q&A series. Please consider following Mallary on social media. She has accounts on Facebook, on Instagram, and she has a Substack. And buy her book. It's available at her publisher, Simon & Schuster, and at Amazon, of course, but also at bookshop.org, which we prefer to recommend because it is the anti-Amazon. It's a platform that funnels orders to independent bookstores. If you're watching or rewatching us from outside the US, Mallory's book is also available in Canada, the United Kingdom, and Australia, and a Spanish language edition aimed at Central and South America and Spain will be released this June 2026. Now, please join us next month on Thursday, the 19th of March, to hear from former CDC Director Dr. Tom Frieden about his new book, The Formula for Better Health. And visit our RSVP page. You can sign up there in advance for that live stream with Dr. Frieden and our later one with Jason Gale. Until next time, I'm Maryn McKenna. On behalf of the Center and the Emory Center for Public Scholarship and Engagement and Ideas Festival Emory, and from me, thank you for watching. See you next month.